You eat, but don't help. His words cut through the room, but I didn't flinch. Still, I felt the weight of them, the betrayal that came from my own son. As I sat there, watching him storm off, the quiet hum of the house filled the space between us. While he raged, I reached for the papers that would change everything. The house, the home we built, was gone. I sold it for $3.5 million. You never respected it, or me. Now, it's my turn to decide what's mine. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Charles sat in his favorite chair, the worn leather creaking beneath him as he turned the pages of his book. The low hum of the house was soothing, a quiet refuge from the world outside. But that tranquility was shattered by the heated voices echoing from the kitchen. He didn't need to strain his ears to hear the words. His son Brian and his wife, Samantha, were arguing again. Brian's voice rose, sharper than usual. You can't keep living like this, Dad. You eat, but you don't help. The words cut through the air, filled with a venom that made Charles's stomach twist. For a moment, Charles didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what had been said. He could feel the heat of Brian's anger in the pit of his stomach. The words stung more than they should have, but he remained still, his fingers tight around the pages of his book. The lines of text blurred, and he didn't bother to blink. It wasn't the first time Brian had lashed out, but this felt different. Samantha's voice was quieter, but there was a coldness in it. Charles could picture her, standing there with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, like she was watching the world burn, a spectator with no stake in the game. She had always been good at hiding her true intentions behind that practiced smile, and Charles had never quite trusted her. The silence in the room felt oppressive as Charles sat there, the argument still ringing in his ears. His pride was bruised, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The old house was full of memories, and those memories felt like ghosts now, haunting him, reminding him of things he'd once taken pride in. But that pride, that sense of self-worth, had been chipped away piece by the people closest to him. Brian's voice broke through again. You're just a burden. You can't even help us with anything. We're struggling. And you just sit here, doing nothing. His words were louder now, thick with frustration and blame. Charles stood up slowly, the floor creaking beneath his weight. He wasn't angry. No, anger was too simple. It was deeper than that. A coldness had settled in his chest, a resignation to the fact that things had changed. But in this house, in this moment, he was no longer part of the equation. He was the outsider, the one who had been abandoned by his own blood, left to quietly fade into the background. Without a word, he walked away. He passed through the hallway, his feet moving as if on autopilot, each step deliberate, controlled. In the quiet of the study, he sank into the chair by his wife's old desk. The letter was waiting for him. It was something he'd been thinking about all afternoon. A simple message to a friend he trusted more than family. He picked up the pen, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. It's time for a change, he wrote. It wasn't a declaration of anything dramatic, but something inside him shifted. Something deep, something that he hadn't let himself acknowledge until now. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. The silence felt almost sacred. As he finished the letter, Charles's gaze lingered on the empty chair across from him, the chair that Ellen, his late wife, used to sit in. The thought of her was a heavy weight, but it no longer brought him grief. It brought clarity. He set the pen down, his mind already working, planning. The house was quiet, but inside, he was beginning to see what had to be done. Charles stood outside Gregory Chase's office, his hand hovering over the door handle. The building was quiet, the faint hum of air conditioning the only sound. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but he wasn't afraid. He had made up his mind. The time had come to act. Gregory, a man who had known Charles for decades, greeted him with a handshake, though there was a hesitancy in his eyes. Charles didn't need to be told that Gregory knew something was wrong. The years of friendship and legal dealings had left their mark, and they both knew how much this moment meant. "I need to sell the house," Charles said, his voice firm but devoid of emotion. Gregory blinked, a slight frown furrowing his brow as he leaned back in his chair. "The house? Charles, that's a big decision. You've built a life there. Well, you and Ellen." His voice softened, remembering the woman who had shared that space, a space now haunted by memories of both joy and sorrow. Charles stared out the window for a long moment. The skyline of the city stretched before him, distant and indifferent. It felt like the entire world was out there waiting for him to make a choice. His choice. "It's not just about the house," Charles replied, the words coming slower than usual, each one laced with quiet resolve. "It's about respect, what I've given, what I've endured. I can't keep pretending like things haven't changed." Gregory opened his mouth, likely to protest, but then he closed it, eyes flicking to the file in front of him. He hesitated again, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. "You know there will be backlash, don't you? Brian and Samantha won't take this well. I can't imagine they'll be pleased." A cold smile crept onto Charles's lips. "I'm sure they won't, but it's not about what they want anymore." He met Gregory's gaze, his voice hardening. "It's about what I want." There was a long pause as Gregory studied Charles, as if trying to gauge whether this was just a momentary lapse in judgment or something deeper. Finally, Gregory sighed and picked up a pen. "Well, if you're sure, we'll need to move quickly. The market's strong and the house will sell for a good price." Charles nodded, his face expressionless. "I don't care about the money. Just get it done." Gregory reached for the documents, sliding them across the desk. As Charles reached for the papers, his mind briefly wandered to the house, his and Ellen's dream, the place where they'd raised Brian and Samantha, where he'd spent countless hours working, thinking, and dreaming of a future that now felt far removed from reality. A flashback surged into his mind. He and Ellen, young and hopeful, standing in the midst of a half-built house. The walls were bare, but they could see the vision taking shape, a life together. The blueprints scattered on the floor between them were the foundation of their love. He remembered the smell of fresh wood, the sound of their laughter filling the air. It was their creation, something they'd built with their own hands. But that was then. The house no longer stood for the same things. Brian and Samantha had made it something else entirely, something ugly, something unrecognizable. Charles signed the papers with deliberate precision. The house was officially on the market now. He could almost hear the echoes of the arguments, the tension that had slowly seeped into every room, every corner. Gregory glanced at the papers and then back at Charles, the weight of the decision hanging heavy between them. "It's done. The sale will go through quietly for $3.5 million. The listing is live." Charles didn't feel any sense of triumph. Instead, he felt a strange emptiness, a hollow space where there had once been hope. "It's time," he said, his voice low, almost distant. Gregory didn't respond, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. Charles stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. As he walked out of the office, the weight of the decision settled deeper into his chest. He wasn't sure if he was freeing himself or shackling his future, but the die had been cast. And as he stepped into the elevator, he knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. Brian's car screeched to a halt in front of the house. Samantha sat beside him, her gaze fixed out the window, her lips pressed tight. The familiar driveway, the warm comfort of home, had always been a place where their lives seemed to make sense, until now. A piece of paper fluttered in the wind, tied to a post outside the gate. The sold sign was bold, glaring in the late afternoon light like a slap to the face. Brian slammed the car into park and threw open the door, his boots pounding the concrete as he stormed up the driveway. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked with fury, disbelief thick in his tone. Samantha hesitated for a moment, then followed him slowly, her eyes wide with confusion, her fingers nervously adjusting her purse. She could feel the tension in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. From the distance, Charles watched them both, his figure still and unmoving in the shadow of the trees. His face, like always, was calm, but there was something in his posture, an implacable certainty, that made it clear this moment was coming. It had to come. It had been a long time in the making. Brian marched up to the sign, yanking it from the post, as if he could rip the reality of it all away. This can't be happening. He turned toward the front door, his face flushed with rage, the veins in his neck pulsing. "Samantha, get inside. I need to talk to him." Samantha lingered for a second, her hand hovering over the door handle, still unable to fully comprehend the absurdity of it. Her eyes met Charles's briefly, but she quickly looked away. There was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't anger. No, it was something far colder. She stepped inside, her heart thudding in her chest. The house that had been their sanctuary was suddenly unfamiliar, as if the walls had turned against them. Brian stormed in after her, his fury growing with each step. He moved into the living room and froze. Charles sat in his usual chair by the window, the same chair he'd always sat in, but now he looked different. There was no warmth in his eyes, no welcome in his posture, just a quiet, resolute man who had already made his decision. "What the hell is going on, Dad?" Brian's voice was ragged, his anger spilling over. "You sold the house, our house, without saying a word to us. Do you even care what this means?" Charles didn't flinch. He simply looked at Brian, his gaze unwavering, the weight of his silence pressing down on the room like an oppressive fog. Samantha stood a few steps behind Brian, a silent observer to a scene that felt as if it were unfolding in slow motion. "It was never your home, Brian," Charles said, his voice quiet, each word carefully measured. "It was mine, and now it's sold." Brian's face twisted in disbelief, the realization creeping up on him like a shadow he couldn't escape. He blinked, as if the words hadn't quite registered, then repeated, "What? What did you say?" Charles didn't answer. The silence between them grew, suffocating and thick. Brian's anger was turning into something else, something darker. The truth, sharp and cutting, hit him all at once. This wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about property or inheritance. It was about something much deeper, something that cut to the core of their relationship. His eyes widened as he processed the finality of it. The betrayal wasn't just in the house being sold. It was in the quiet, deliberate way Charles had withdrawn from them, from everything they had once taken for granted. The house wasn't theirs anymore. It never had been. Brian's fists clenched at his sides, his breath shallow and quick. His world was unraveling before him, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know how to fix it. Samantha stood behind him, her expression frozen in a mixture of fear and confusion. She had no idea what to say. Nothing she could say would undo this. Charles remained seated, his gaze locked on Brian. The calmness in his father's eyes only made the situation worse. The air was thick with unresolved tension, the kind that had been building for years but had finally come to a head. The house had sold, but what about the family? What had been left behind in the wreckage of their past? Brian opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, there was just silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. And that silence hung in the air, leaving them all on the edge of something they weren't quite ready to face. Charles sat in the sleek, modern apartment, the kind of place he'd never thought he'd inhabit. It was high above the city, nestled in a glass tower that stretched toward the clouds. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking, the skyline a jagged silhouette against the fading orange of the evening sky. Below him, the world moved on. People, cars, the hum of life. And it all felt so far removed from the small, suffocating house he had just left behind. The apartment was a stark contrast to what he had known. No creaky floors, no dusty corners. It was perfect, pristine, and eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that allowed him to hear his own thoughts, each one sharper than the last. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he watched the city below. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Peace wasn't something he had felt much of lately, not with the constant noise of Brian and Samantha's demands, their entitlement, their endless expectations. He had given them everything for years, and yet it was never enough. But now, in this place, there was none of that. No anger, no guilt, no feeling of being trapped. Just the hum of the city and the feeling of a chapter closing. Meanwhile, Brian and Samantha were scrambling. It hadn't taken long for the gravity of their situation to sink in. The house, their home, was gone. They were forced to find a new place to live, but reality was harder to face than they had imagined. Samantha scrolled through her phone, her eyes scanning the listings. Brian sat across from her, his hand buried in his hair, frustration growing with each passing minute. "We can't afford something like this," Samantha muttered, her voice tight with anxiety. "This is insane. We had everything, and now we have nothing." She tossed the phone down on the table, her eyes darting to Brian's face, searching for some glimmer of reassurance. But finding none. His jaw was clenched, his thoughts miles away. Brian shot her a look. "I know," he said, his voice thick with bitterness. "It's all falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." His gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "He did this. Your father—" "Don't," Samantha snapped, cutting him off. She was tired of hearing the same thing over and over again. "He didn't do anything. We did this. It's us, Brian." But her words didn't help. They both knew the truth. Their world was crumbling, and there was no easy way out. They were no longer in control of their fate. The safety net was gone. Back in his new apartment, Charles sank deeper into the silence. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Gregory Chase, his old lawyer, but it didn't matter. Charles didn't need any more reminders of what had been done. What mattered now was what came next. As he let the quiet fill the room again, he dialed Lucy Fields, his longtime friend. Her voice, warm and familiar, crackled through the line when she answered. "Charles?" she asked, already knowing. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady, a hint of satisfaction underneath the calm. "I've done it, Lucy. It's done. The house is sold. They're out. It's time they learn." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, but Charles didn't need to explain further. Lucy understood. She'd been there through the years of frustration, the slow burn of watching his family drift further from him. "Well then," Lucy said softly, a knowing smile in her tone. "I guess it's finally time, isn't it?" Charles didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about setting things right, making them see what they had lost, and forcing them to learn what they had never understood before. As he stared out the window, the city lights beginning to twinkle beneath him, Charles felt an unexpected weight lifting from his shoulders. The storm wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken. And that step, no matter how small it seemed, was enough to make him believe that perhaps peace was finally within his reach. But the silence in the apartment wasn't just empty space. It was a promise, one that would echo far beyond the walls of this place. What came next? That was the question, and one Charles wasn't ready to answer just yet. The phone call came as no surprise. though the urgency in Brian's voice sent a ripple of anticipation through Charles. Brian had been stewing ever since the sale, his calls and messages piling up in Charles's inbox, each more desperate than the last. But this one was different. This was the one where Brian finally demanded a meeting. Charles picked up the phone and listened to the strained, almost pleading tone in his son's voice. "We need to meet. This has to be sorted out. Now." Charles didn't hesitate. He knew what Brian wanted, knew what this meeting would be. And yet, something inside him stirred, a quiet satisfaction, the flicker of resolve that had been growing ever since the house was sold. "Fine. I'll meet you at the cafe," Charles said, his voice calm, controlled, betraying none of the tension swirling beneath the surface. The cafe was quiet when they arrived. The soft murmur of conversation and clinking cups providing an almost surreal backdrop for the collision of two lives about to unfold. Charles sat at a small table by the window, watching the street outside with a detached calm. He could already picture Brian's anger, could almost hear the frustration rising in his son's chest, the same way it always had. But today, it wouldn't work. Today, Charles wasn't going to bend. Brian burst through the door like a storm, his eyes wild, his face flushed with the raw emotion he'd been holding back for weeks. His steps were heavy, each one marked by a sense of entitlement that had never fully left him. He didn't even acknowledge the barista at the counter, marching straight to Charles's table. "You've got some nerve, old man," Brian spat, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of the chair. "You took everything from us. Everything." His voice cracked as he said it, the rawness of the emotion unmasking the man beneath the anger, scared, hurt, desperate. Charles didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto Brian's, and for a moment, it was as if time stood still between them. The years of disappointment, the slow unraveling of their relationship, all of it culminated in this moment, in this simple, painful confrontation. "I gave you everything, Brian," Charles said, his voice steady, the words carefully chosen. "Everything you asked for, everything you wanted. But you never appreciated it, not once. All that time I was there, and you never once saw me, not for who I am, not for what I've done." Brian recoiled at the words, his face contorting with the realization of what his father was saying. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. His chest tightened, but he couldn't speak. The words were caught in his throat. His anger was still there, but it was no longer the dominant force. Now there was guilt, and resentment, and something far worse, regret. "You've made your bed, now lie in it," Charles added, his voice colder, more detached than it had ever been before. The finality of those words echoed in the space between them, hanging like a heavy cloud. Brian's hands balled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. His breath came in sharp bursts, his mind scrambling for something to say, something that would make this make sense, something that could reverse the damage. But there was nothing. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too late to change it. "I can't believe you're saying this," Brian whispered, his voice faltering as the fight drained from him. He stood there for a long moment, the anger dissipating, leaving nothing but a gnawing emptiness. He had lost, and he knew it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, the weight of defeat settling heavily on him. The door swung open and shut behind him, and Charles watched him go. There was no satisfaction in the moment, just a quiet understanding that this was the way it had to be. But as Brian's retreating figure disappeared into the distance, Charles couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Or was this just the beginning of something else? The whispers started slowly at first, here and there between neighbors, at the local grocery store, and during quiet evenings at the corner cafe. But soon, the gossip spread like wildfire, fanned by Samantha's cold, calculated words. She painted her father-in-law as a greedy, bitter old man, a man who cared only for himself, who had taken everything from her family without remorse. He's lost it, Samantha told anyone who would listen. He's so consumed by his pride, he's willing to destroy everything we've built. He doesn't care about his family anymore. He only cares about making us suffer. The words dripped with venom, each one more pointed than the last. It didn't take long for the community to latch on, hungry for the kind of drama that always bubbled beneath the surface of family life. Brian heard the rumors too. His phone rang with calls from old friends, his business associates, even distant relatives. "What's going on, Brian?" they asked. "Is it true what they're saying about your father?" He could hear the judgment in their voices, the undercurrent of disbelief. But Brian didn't know how to defend the man who had once been a father to him, who had just turned his back on him. The house was gone. The life he knew was shattered, and nothing he said could change that. Samantha's words had found fertile ground in his mind, twisting what little was left of his trust in Charles. And now, there was a growing pressure, an overwhelming feeling that he had to act, to make things right in some way. But how? The house was gone. There was nothing left to save. The letter came a few days later, arriving in the mail, its weight heavier than any words on paper should have been. Brian had written it, demanding that Charles return the house. The words were laced with desperation, with a sense of entitlement that made Charles's blood run cold. Charles read the letter slowly, his fingers tight around the paper. "You took everything from us. We need it back now. You have no right to do this." The words hit him like a slap, but they didn't stir the anger they should have. Instead, they left him with a strange sense of calm. Brian's demand wasn't a surprise. It was what he expected, what he knew would come. But Charles had already made his choice. The house was gone, and it wasn't coming back. "You don't own me," Charles muttered under his breath as he set the letter down. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. Not Brian, not Samantha, and certainly not the community that had already written him off as a villain. Lucy called later that evening. Her voice was soft, understanding, and full of sympathy. "I heard the news," she said. "I know it must be hard, Charles, but you're not alone in this." Charles leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city lights. He could hear the hum of the world outside, but in his apartment, there was only silence. He appreciated Lucy's concern, but her words felt distant. He had long since stopped caring what people thought. He had made his decision. And though the weight of it still pressed on him, he wasn't backing down. "I didn't do this for them," Charles said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I did it for me." He didn't need anyone's approval, not anymore. What mattered now was his own peace, his own sense of justice. The tension in his chest tightened, but it wasn't from regret. It was from something else, a strength he hadn't felt in years, a resolve that was starting to solidify. Charles had taken the first step, and he wasn't turning back. As he hung up the phone, his gaze lingered on the skyline outside his window. There was still much to come. Brian and Samantha's anger wouldn't be easily quelled. The whispers in the community would grow louder, but for the first time in a long time, Charles felt like he was finally in control. And as the night stretched on, he realized the real battle was just beginning. Brian and Samantha's world, once full of promise and entitlement, was crumbling faster than they could manage. The bills piled up, the pressure mounting as their financial problems worsened. The lavish lifestyle they had come to expect was slipping through their fingers, and they had no idea how to stop it. Samantha, once so confident in her ability to navigate the world of luxury, found herself staring at listing after listing, none of which came close to what they needed. The high-end apartments, the gated communities, they were no longer within reach. "We can't do this," Samantha muttered one evening, her fingers dragging over her phone screen, unable to even look at Brian. "We can't afford anything like this. Not anything." The words hit her with the weight of reality, harsh, unforgiving. She hadn't ever imagined that this day would come. They had always been able to fall back on Charles. Now, with no safety net, The world felt cold and empty. Brian sat across from her, rubbing his temples, a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. The life they'd built was disappearing in front of him, and every attempt to hold on to it made it slip away faster. The money, the house, the comfort, it had all been ripped from their hands, and now they were scrambling to make sense of it all. Friends, once eager to offer their support, had started to distance themselves. They could see the decline, the change in Brian and Samantha. The calls and messages slowed, and soon they were left with only the harsh echoes of their own failure. Charles heard about their struggles, of course. It didn't take long for the news to trickle back to him. Brian's desperation had reached its peak, and he'd reached out, asking for help. But Charles felt no pity, none at all. He had already given them everything he could, money, time, advice, and none of it had mattered. Now, it was their turn to face the consequences of their actions. Brian's voice had been rough on the phone, the weight of his pride finally cracking. "Dad, I need help. We don't know what to do. We're losing everything. Please, I need you to step in, just this once for us." Charles paused, the cold silence stretching between them, before he spoke, his voice steady but unmoving. "You didn't help me, Brian, not when I needed it. Now, figure it out. I'm not your safety net anymore." The words hit Brian harder than he expected. His chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. This was the final step, the one he had been dreading, the one that would push him over the edge. There was no coming back from this. No more handouts, no more easy fixes. Charles's thoughts, however, were already solidified. "It's your turn to stand on your own," he thought, his heart hardening, the years of being taken for granted solidifying into something far colder. He had spent so long bending to the whims of his family, always giving, always sacrificing. Now it was over. The lessons had been delivered, and it was time for them to learn the hardest one of all. As days turned into weeks, Brian's pride took a brutal hit. He was forced to swallow his anger and humiliation, trying to piece together a life from the wreckage of his past. Samantha, too, felt the sting of failure, but it was the bitterness that crept in, coiling around her heart, making every day feel heavier than the last. She resented Charles more than she had ever thought possible. He had destroyed their lives, and now it was up to them to pick up the pieces, if they even could. Charles watched from his apartment, a quiet observer to the chaos he had set in motion. His own emotions were muted, but there was no regret, no second guessing. The decision had been made. It was no longer about them. It was about him, about reclaiming what had been stripped away for so long. He knew the lesson had been delivered, whether they understood it yet or not. But as the days passed, he couldn't help but wonder, how long before they broke completely? How much more would they have to lose before the truth finally sank in? The news spread faster than anyone could have predicted. What started as a quiet family issue quickly snowballed into something much larger, much uglier. The media caught wind of the scandal surrounding Charles's sale of the house, and soon headlines screamed from every corner of the city. "Old man sticks it to entitled son" was plastered across the front pages of the tabloids, and the story was everywhere, on TV, in gossip columns, and across social media. The public couldn't get enough of it. The image of a father turning on his own flesh and blood was irresistible. They painted Charles as the villain in this family drama, the cold patriarch who had callously cut off his son and daughter-in-law, leaving them with nothing. They painted Brian as the victim, the hard-working entrepreneur who had been betrayed by the man who should have supported him. But while the world watched with judgment, Charles remained untouched. He was calm, composed, his demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos that had consumed Brian and Samantha. He didn't engage with the media, didn't entertain the public's hunger for scandal. He knew what was happening, of course. He wasn't blind to the whispers, to the endless speculation about his motives. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had made his decision, and the consequences, whatever they might be, were not his problem to fix. Meanwhile, Brian's world was unraveling. He had always prided himself on his reputation, on being the man who could handle anything. But now he found himself on the defensive, fighting to salvage what was left of his image. His attempts to speak out only made things worse. The more he tried to explain, the more the public saw him as weak, desperate, and unable to cope with the consequences of his own actions. Every interview he gave seemed to dig him deeper into the hole, his words twisting into self-pity rather than strength. Samantha, always quick to manage crises, saw the damage to their public image and insisted that they take control. "We need to turn this around," she said, her voice strained with panic. "We need to show them we're not the bad guys. We need to fight back." But Brian's efforts to do so fell flat. His anger, once his greatest asset, now worked against him. The more he raged against his father, the more people saw his frustration as entitlement, his failure to understand the gravity of his situation. Samantha's cold, calculating nature emerged as she strategized their next moves, but even she couldn't undo the damage. The more she pushed, the more she realized there was no way to change the narrative. The public had already made up their mind. They saw Brian and Samantha as the victims, but their reaction, full of anger and denial, only solidified the perception that they were not in control of their own lives. Through all of this, Charles stayed out of the spotlight, retreating into his new, quiet life. He didn't engage with the media, didn't give interviews. He didn't need to. The world could see the chaos unfolding, the unraveling of Brian and Samantha's facade, and Charles felt no need to step in. The backlash that was raining down on his son was exactly what he had been waiting for, the moment when Brian and Samantha would finally understand the cost of their arrogance. The weight of the situation, however, was beginning to take its toll on Brian and Samantha. They had hoped for a quick resolution, some way to regain their footing. But now, they were trapped in the mess they had made, and there was no escaping it. Brian could feel his pride crumbling with each passing day. Samantha's eyes, once filled with confidence, were now clouded with doubt. They had underestimated the consequences of their actions, and now there was no way to undo what had been done. The world was watching, and the harder they fought to salvage their reputation, the more they lost control. Brian's footsteps echoed down the hallway of Charles's apartment, each step heavier than the last. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white with the force of his frustration. The door swung open with a force that rattled the hinges, and Brian stormed into the room, his eyes wild with desperation. "You owe me an explanation," he shouted, his voice raw and desperate, a sharp edge of anger in every syllable. "Why didn't you help us? Why did you do this?" His voice cracked on the last word, the weight of the question too much to hold in. He had been asking himself that very thing for days now. Why? Why had his father abandoned him when he needed him most? Wasn't that what family was supposed to do? Charles was calm. Too calm. He stood by the window, the soft light of the city casting a shadow over his features, making him seem almost detached. His hands were folded behind his back, his posture rigid, as if he were the one in control, the one who had all the answers. His eyes didn't meet Brian's. They didn't need to. "You never once appreciated what you had," Charles said quietly, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get help when you don't respect the hand that feeds you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth that Brian had been too blind to see for years. His chest tightened as he felt the weight of his father's words settle over him. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything. The years of resentment, the bitterness, the way Brian had taken everything for granted. Brian swallowed hard, the anger still bubbling beneath the surface, but it was quickly replaced by something else: regret. He took a step forward, his eyes pleading. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. I didn't appreciate what you did for us. I thought you owed us. I was wrong, I see that now. Please, Dad, help us. We need you." But Charles didn't move. He didn't flinch. His silence was more deafening than any words could have been. Brian's pleas seemed to bounce off him like water off a stone. Charles's gaze remained fixed on the skyline outside, as though the man who had once been his son didn't even exist in the space between them anymore. Samantha appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes narrowed. She had followed Brian, though she hadn't yet spoken. The tension in the room was suffocating, but she said nothing at first. Her bitterness still hung in the air like a thick fog, but something was different. For the first time, she stood still, silent, unsure of what to say, as if even her sharp words had failed her. Charles turned slowly to face her. "It's over, Brian," he said, his voice colder than it had ever been. "You made your choices, and now you'll live with them. I don't owe you anything." The words struck Brian like a punch to the gut, the finality in Charles's voice cutting through him. His pride, what little of it remained, crumbled in that moment. He had never imagined it would come to this, to stand before his father, begging for mercy, only to have the door slammed in his face. He opened his mouth to speak again, but there was nothing left. No words that could undo the damage, no plea that would change Charles's mind. Brian stood there for a long moment, unable to find the strength to leave, but unable to stay. His world was falling apart, and there was no one left to pick up the pieces. Samantha, silent as ever, stood at the door watching him. The bitterness in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was no comfort to be found in her gaze. Finally, Brian turned and walked out, each step dragging him further into the darkness of his own failure. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, leaving Charles standing alone, watching the world outside. And as Brian's footsteps faded into the distance, Charles didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel vindicated. He simply felt nothing. The days that followed the confrontation with Charles were long and suffocating for Brian. He spent hours staring at the same walls, his thoughts replaying over and over, each one more damning than the last. At night, when the weight of everything pressed down on him, he found himself unable to sleep, unable to escape the memory of his father's words. "You made your choices." He hadn't realized, not fully, how selfish he had been, how deeply his actions had hurt not just Charles, but the very foundation of his own family. The more he reflected, the clearer it became. He had taken everything for granted: his father's support, his mother's sacrifices, the life they had built. All of it had seemed like it would always be there, something to fall back on, until it wasn't. The realization stung, cutting deeper than the loss of the house. Brian had been so wrapped up in his own desires, in his own ambitions, that he had failed to see the truth. He had treated Charles like an ATM, a resource to be tapped when it was convenient, never once stopping to think about what his father might need or feel. It was never about the money. It was about respect. Charles's words echoed in his mind, and Brian couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of shame. But the damage was done. The house was gone. His relationship with Charles, perhaps irreparably broken. And now, it felt like everything he had once known was slipping through his fingers, leaving him with nothing. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was no easy way to undo what had already been done. Samantha, too, was changing. The weeks after the confrontation had only deepened the divide between them. She had begun to isolate herself, retreating into her own world, her doubts about Brian growing with each passing day. The frustration, the anger, had all but faded. What remained was a quiet disillusionment. She no longer trusted Brian's ability to fix things, to make them right. Every time he reached out, trying to apologize, trying to explain himself, she recoiled. Her eyes, once filled with hope, now looked at him with a cool distance, as though she were seeing him for the first time. And what she saw was a man who had failed them both. Meanwhile, Charles seemed to be moving forward with a quiet strength that Brian could neither comprehend nor match. He had retreated into his new life, taking small, contented steps, working on projects that mattered to him, spending more time with Lucy, enjoying a peace that Brian had never seen in him before. He didn't rush or chase after anything. He simply was. And for the first time in a long time, Charles felt the weight of his decisions lift, replaced by something more solid, a sense of accomplishment, of knowing he had done what was necessary, not for revenge, but for his own peace. Brian, in contrast, found himself stuck, unable to move forward, unable to escape the weight of his mistakes. He started to see the lessons that had been hammered into him by his father, not as a punishment, but as a way forward. Humility, hard work, the realization that nothing in life came without effort. That was something he hadn't understood before. He'd always believed things would fall into place, that his ambition alone would carry him. But now, he saw the hard truth. Ambition, without foundation, without integrity, was hollow. And without a foundation, nothing would last. Charles, as always, seemed miles away from him now, both physically and emotionally. But the more Brian thought about it, the more he realized he was the one who had to rebuild, not just his life, but his very character. And that would take time. Time he wasn't sure he had. The truth was simple, yet painful. Brian had no one to blame but himself. And now, with everything crumbling around him, he had to ask himself the hardest question of all. Where do I go from here? Brian stood at the door of Charles's apartment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like an unbearable force. The silence between them was thick, palpable. For so long, he had held onto his pride, refusing to admit how far he had fallen. But today, it felt like that pride was no longer worth carrying. His knuckles hovered over the door, shaking slightly. He hadn't come for money, not this time. He had come for something he never thought he'd need: guidance. When Charles opened the door, his expression was unreadable. He stepped aside without a word, allowing Brian into the apartment. There was a distance between them now, a gulf wider than any argument or decision could ever bridge. Brian had no illusions that this would be easy. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew this was the moment he needed to face. "I need help," Brian said, the words coming out more fragile than he intended. He stood there, his body tense, his voice a little rough from the weight of everything he had been carrying. "Not money. I don't need that. I need guidance." The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if he was speaking a language he hadn't used in years. He wasn't just asking for advice. He was asking for something deeper, something that felt out of reach. Charles didn't respond right away. He didn't rush to offer comfort or answers. He simply stood there, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp, as though he were weighing every word, every gesture. The silence hung between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Brian shifted his weight, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "I've been so selfish. I've spent so long thinking about myself, about what I wanted, that I forgot everything that mattered. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix me." His voice cracked, raw with frustration and regret. "I don't even know where to start." Charles's gaze didn't waver. His voice, when it came, was steady and calm, so calm it almost felt like a judgment. "You've got the strength," he said simply, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he looked at Brian. "Now you need to use it." Brian blinked, the words striking him harder than he expected. He had always thought strength was about success, about winning, about pushing through. But now, hearing his father speak those words, it hit him. Real strength wasn't in force or ambition. It was in discipline, in humility, in knowing when to ask for help, and in using that help to change. The silence that followed was different this time. It was a pause, a moment where neither of them spoke, but both were thinking. Brian could feel the weight of his father's words sinking in, each one heavier than the last. For the first time in years, he was starting to understand how little he had known about his father, about himself, about life. They talked more than they had in years. The conversation wasn't easy, nor was it resolved. There were no neat answers, no instant solutions. It was just two men, talking honestly about the past, the present, and what lay ahead. The years of tension weren't wiped away with a few words. But for the first time in so long, Brian felt like he was being seen, and he wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was a start. As Brian stood to leave, Charles didn't stop him. The weight of their conversation hung between them, unspoken but understood. Brian knew the road to redemption wouldn't be quick. It would be long, hard, and filled with moments of doubt. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to walk it. Charles watched him go, knowing that only time would tell if Brian could truly change. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Charles standing in the quiet of his apartment, the silence once again swallowing the space between them. And in that quiet, Charles couldn't help but wonder if Brian would truly find his way, or if he would slip back into the mistakes of the past. Brian and Samantha stood at the edge of something new, something raw and uncertain. It wasn't the life they had imagined, not by a long shot. The house was gone, the luxury they had once known a distant memory. The future felt like a blank page, the weight of the past pressing on their shoulders, but they had nowhere else to go but forward. Brian had taken a job in a completely different field, one he'd never even considered before. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what he had dreamed of, but it was work, a chance to prove to himself and to the world that he wasn't just his failures. The first few weeks were a blur. The hours were long, the pay was modest, but the humility of it all was a necessary shock. It wasn't easy. Every day he felt the sting of his pride, the remnants of a man who had once been so sure of himself, so certain that the world owed him. But now he was learning to work harder, to push himself past the point of comfort. Samantha, too, was adjusting. The life she had once imagined was slipping away, replaced by a reality she hadn't been prepared for. She took a part-time job at a local boutique, something simple, something steady. The hours weren't as long, but the work was honest, and as she walked home at night, carrying her small paycheck, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had fallen. The designer clothes, the fancy dinners, the status, none of it mattered now. She had to let go of the life she had clung to, the one built on expectations. She couldn't control the world anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she started to realize that maybe that was okay. From his quiet apartment, Charles watched them both from a distance, his presence unspoken, but always there. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to steer them. He had done what he could, had shown them the door, but the rest was up to them. His decision to let them find their own way wasn't easy, but it was necessary. His relationship with Brian had been strained for years, and now it was up to his son to prove he could stand on his own 2 feet. Charles knew the road would be long for them. There were no quick fixes, no shortcuts, but he was content to let them figure it out. They had to do this for themselves. As time passed, a shift began to occur in the family dynamic. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden embrace of old wounds, but there was a new undercurrent of respect. It was tentative, fragile, like a seed just starting to break through the soil. Brian didn't yet fully understand it, but he was beginning to. Samantha, too, was learning that respect wasn't something you demanded. It had to be earned day by day through actions, not words. And though they still had a long way to go, something had started to change. Lucy, who had watched Charles's quiet resolve from the sidelines, couldn't help but express her pride in him one afternoon. "You did the right thing, you know," she said over a cup of coffee. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness in her words. "You showed them what it means to truly stand on your own." Charles didn't respond, but the faint smile on his lips said more than words ever could. He knew he hadn't just done it for them. He had done it for himself, for his peace, for his future. Brian and Samantha were finding their footing again, slowly, quietly. They weren't where they had been, and they weren't sure where they were headed, but the instability was no longer as terrifying. There was a sense of forward motion, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. They had started to rebuild their lives, piece by piece. But as they looked at the road ahead, they both knew they were still a long way from where they once were. And the question lingered. Would they ever truly find their way back? Or was the life they once had gone forever? Brian sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face, but his mind was elsewhere. The decision in front of him was monumental. A deal had landed in his lap, one that could change everything if it went through. It was an opportunity he had worked toward for years, a chance to solidify his position in the business world. But it also came with risks, huge risks, the kind that could break him if it went wrong. He stared at the email in front of him, the terms laid out clearly, but his thoughts were clouded. The numbers made sense, the potential was there, but something inside him hesitated. He had never been this unsure before. His instincts were fighting against the opportunity, a voice deep inside telling him to be cautious, to wait. Yet he knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. He needed to make a choice. He picked up his phone and dialed Charles's number. It had been a while since they last spoke, since the conversation that had set him on this path. Charles had been silent, distant, but Brian knew that his father, of all people, could offer him the clarity he needed. Even if their relationship was strained, Charles had always been a man of principle, someone who had seen it all. He might not give him the answers, but he would point him in the right direction. The phone rang once, twice, then Charles's calm voice answered. "Brian." "Dad," Brian said, his voice thick with the weight of uncertainty. "I've got a decision to make. This deal, it could make or break me. But I'm not sure if it's the right move. I don't know if I can trust it. I need advice. I'm not sure what to do." Charles's silence on the other end of the line stretched for a moment, then he spoke, his tone steady and unwavering. "Trust your instincts, Brian. You know what's right." The simplicity of the advice hit Brian harder than he expected. It wasn't the concrete, detailed guidance he had been hoping for. But as the words settled in, something inside him shifted. His instincts had been buried under layers of doubt, of failure, of his own insecurities. He had spent so long second-guessing himself, relying on others to guide him, that he had forgotten how to trust what he knew deep down. "Trust your instincts," Charles repeated, his voice softer this time, as if understanding the weight of those words. "You've got this." Brian sat back in his chair, his fingers running through his hair. His father's words rang in his ears, cutting through the noise of his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity, an inner certainty that had been absent for years. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. With newfound determination, he made the call to finalize the deal. The next few hours were a blur, negotiations, signatures, and final confirmations. The weight on his shoulders, the constant tension of whether it would all collapse, slowly began to lift as the deal solidified. By the time it was done, Brian felt something he hadn't felt in years: relief. The deal had gone through. It was a success. He had finally done it. As he leaned back in his chair, the weight lifting from his chest, he realized that it wasn't just the business that had changed. It was him. For the first time, he was standing on his own. He had trusted himself, taken a risk, and succeeded. From the other room, Samantha watched him, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For the first time, she was seeing Brian in a new light. She hadn't expected this, a man who had stumbled, who had struggled, but now standing stronger than she had ever seen him before. But even as Brian celebrated the success, a part of him knew that the real victory wasn't the deal. It was the realization that he had learned how to trust himself, something he had never done before. And yet, as the triumph settled in, another question lingered. Would this newfound strength be enough to rebuild everything that had been broken, or was this just the beginning of an even deeper journey? Brian sat in his new office, looking out at the bustling city below. The glass walls offered an unobstructed view of the skyline, but today The view felt distant, irrelevant. His focus wasn't on the busy streets or the thriving companies around him. Instead, his mind was on the moment he had been working toward for months, the moment when his relationship with his father, Charles, might shift, might actually begin to heal. It had been years since they had shared anything close to a real conversation, since the tension between them had been anything less than palpable. But today was different. Today he was inviting Charles into this new chapter of his life, into a part of his world he had never shared before. Charles arrived at the office just as the lunch hour began to settle into a quiet hum. He was as composed as always, his slow, deliberate movements speaking volumes about his unshakable presence. Brian had expected him to feel out of place here, surrounded by the slick, modern design of the office, but Charles walked in as though he belonged. "I'm glad you invited me," Charles said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Brian led him to the small conference room, a table set for two. It was a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but it was enough, a quiet reprieve from the chaos of their past. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching between them, heavy yet not uncomfortable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world outside continued on as usual, oblivious to the quiet moment unfolding between father and son. Brian felt the weight of years of unresolved emotions pressing down on him, but he knew this was the moment to finally break the silence. "I wouldn't be here without you," Brian said suddenly, his voice softer than he expected. It was the first time in years that he had spoken those words, and even as they left his mouth, he felt a vulnerability that he had buried deep inside for so long. His gaze faltered for a moment, then met Charles's. "I couldn't have done this without your tough love, even when I didn't understand it. I thought you were just punishing me, but I see now that you were just trying to make me stand on my own." Charles didn't flinch, didn't react with sentimentality like Brian had feared. Instead, he simply nodded, his face unreadable, as if weighing Brian's words carefully. "You were always capable of this," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You just had to realize it yourself. I never doubted you, but I couldn't do it for you." There it was, the answer Brian had been searching for. Charles's approval, not in grand gestures or dramatic affirmations, but in the quiet recognition of his growth. There were no tears, no emotional outbursts, just a simple acknowledgement of the journey they had both endured. For the first time, in what felt like forever, the years of tension began to dissolve. The resentment, the misunderstandings, it all seemed so distant now. This was not a magical moment of resolution, but a simple truth. They were both finally on the same page. Not father and son in the way they used to be, but as two people who had been through the fire, each learning from the other, each evolving into something different. They shared the rest of the meal in relative quiet, the conversation flowing easier now, each word carrying less weight than before. They didn't need to explain everything or fill every gap with words. It was enough to just be in each other's presence. For once, there was no pressure, no expectations, just understanding. As they finished, Brian felt something shift in him, a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. They weren't fully healed, but they were closer than they had been in years. And for the first time, Brian believed that they might finally be moving forward. But even as the meal ended, there was still something unresolved in the air, something that lingered in the quiet spaces between them. Would this peace last? Would they both continue to change? Or was this just the beginning of another long journey? Samantha stood outside Charles's apartment, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of her phone. The decision to come here had taken days to build, each moment more daunting than the last. The weight of everything she had done, everything she had allowed herself to become, hung over her like a storm cloud. It was hard to imagine that the woman who had once held so much power over the family was now here, standing at his door, vulnerable and unsure. But it was time to face what she had avoided for too long. She pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing down the hallway, and for a moment, she considered walking away. But she didn't. She had to do this. For herself, for Brian, and for the family they had all shattered. Charles opened the door, his expression unreadable as usual. He didn't ask her in, but he didn't refuse either. His gaze lingered on her for a long moment, searching, assessing. "Samantha," he said simply, the weight of the name hanging between them. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, but she pushed forward. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I know I've done things I can't undo, things that have hurt you, and the family." Charles didn't interrupt, but his silence felt like a steady pressure, urging her to continue. His eyes were focused on her, but they didn't seem filled with anger or accusation. He was waiting, quietly patient, as if he had already heard the words he needed to hear, but wanted to see if she would say them. "I was wrong," she said, her voice soft but firm, the weight of those words settling in her chest. The admission burned, but it was the truth, and there was no escaping it now. "I've manipulated people, including Brian. I twisted things to make myself feel better, to make me feel like I had some control. But I see now what I lost. I lost everything that mattered." Samantha paused, searching Charles's face for any sign, any reaction. But he didn't speak, didn't shift his stance. He was as still as ever, and it only made her feel smaller, more exposed. But she pushed through the discomfort. "I've caused a lot of damage," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't fix it. I know that. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I've done." Charles remained silent, his face unreadable, but his gaze didn't waver. Samantha wasn't sure if she was waiting for forgiveness or if she just needed him to acknowledge the weight of what she had said. But he didn't rush to speak, as if giving her time to sit with the truth of her words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "You'll find your way, Samantha. You've got to. But it's not my job to fix what you've broken." His words weren't harsh, but there was no softness either. It was clear he wasn't offering his approval. Not yet, not fully. Samantha nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. The road ahead was hers to walk, and Charles knew it too. He wasn't ready to fully forgive her, not now. His forgiveness wasn't a quick gift, easily given. It would take time. But the fact that he hadn't turned her away, hadn't shut the door in her face, meant something. Samantha stood there for a long moment, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions. She didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but this was a start. And for that, there was a quiet sense of relief. As she turned to leave, Charles watched her go, his thoughts unreadable. He knew that the journey of self-reflection she had begun wouldn't be easy, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was a step towards something better. As the door closed behind her, Charles stood still, his gaze lingering on the empty space where she had been. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like progress. The echoes of Charles's decision to sell the house reverberated through the family in ways he had never anticipated. At first, it was just a matter of his own quiet resolve, a personal choice to take back what had been taken from him over the years. But as the days passed, the consequences of that decision began to unfold, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they could no longer be ignored. Brian's life, once dominated by pride and entitlement, had been reduced to something unrecognizable. The house was gone, and with it, the illusion of success he had built up around himself. But Brian was different now. He had returned to the world of work, not as a man of privilege, but as someone who had to prove himself. And, slowly but surely, his comeback began to take shape. It was a humble rebirth, and in that humility, a quiet strength started to show, His colleagues didn't see the entitled son of a wealthy man anymore. They saw a man willing to work for his place at the table. That was the change, the symbol of everything that had shifted in him. Brian wasn't the same person he was before, and neither was the world that had once been his to command. Samantha, too, had begun to reshape herself, though in quieter, more subtle ways. The life she had once lived, the endless shopping sprees, the extravagant parties, was gone, replaced by a humbler existence. She worked hard, learned to adjust her expectations, and came to terms with the fact that nothing in life was guaranteed. She realized that respect, success, and even stability had to be earned, not demanded. For the first time in years, she understood that security wasn't something to be handed to her. It was something to be built, step by step, from the ground up. The family, once so fractured, had reshaped itself. There were no grand reunions or tearful reconciliations. There didn't need to be. It was something quieter, something deeper. They had learned to move forward, not as individuals with separate agendas, but as people bound by the shared lessons of the past. They were still figuring out what it meant to be a family again, but there was a sense that they were finally on the same page, if not entirely, then in spirit. They no longer stood on the same ground as before, but they were walking in the same direction. Through it all, Charles's quiet strength remained unshaken. The world had come at him from all sides, had tried to break him with its demands and expectations, but he had remained steadfast. He hadn't needed to justify his decisions, hadn't needed anyone's approval. His peace came not from being right, but from knowing that he had made the right choice. As he sat alone, watching the sun dip below the horizon from his apartment, Charles reflected on the long road that had brought him here. Sometimes letting go is the only way forward, he thought, a quiet acceptance filling him. It was a painful truth, but it was true nonetheless. He had let go of so much, his pride, his hopes for the future, even the people he had once loved, in ways he thought would never change. But now, in the stillness of his apartment, he could feel the peace that had settled around him. It wasn't the peace of having everything fall into place. It was the peace of knowing that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that brought about the most meaningful change. Peace had returned to his life, but it wasn't a peace that had been earned easily. It was a peace built on hard lessons learned, on the kind of growth that only came from loss and sacrifice. And though the road ahead still stretched long before him, Charles felt certain of one thing. He had finally found the kind of peace that only comes after everything else has been stripped away. But as the night deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something else, something unresolved that lingered just out of reach. What would the future hold for them all now that the dust had settled? The peace he had fought so hard for might have finally arrived, but there were still chapters to be written. Brian stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, the weight of their eyes on him. The prestigious business conference had invited him to speak, an opportunity he had once only dreamed of. It was a surreal moment, one that felt both earned and still somehow out of reach. His company was gaining momentum, its growth a reflection of the long hours, the setbacks, the lessons learned from his failures. He had rebuilt himself from the ground up, and this was his moment to share his story. As he spoke, the words felt more natural than he expected. He wasn't reciting a rehearsed pitch or trying to sell himself anymore. He was simply telling the truth. His journey, once marked by entitlement and arrogance, now reflected the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had been forced to learn humility the hard way. He spoke of the struggles, the fall from grace, and the slow climb back to the top, not with pride, but with gratitude. The audience listened, and for the first time, Brian realized he wasn't just sharing his success. He was sharing the person he had become. The media, once skeptical, had begun to view Brian in a new light. Where they had once labeled him as a failure, a spoiled rich kid who couldn't handle the pressure, they now painted him as a success story. The headlines changed. From entitled son to humble entrepreneur was one of the softer takes. The public was captivated by his transformation, rooting for the man who had struggled and finally found his way. It wasn't just his business acumen they were admiring. It was the story of the man who had fallen and found a way to stand again. Samantha, though still hesitant, watched from the sidelines. She had always supported Brian, but now she was starting to see him in a different light. It was subtle, this shift in her perception. She had seen him at his worst, and she had been the one to stand by him when he had no one else. But now, as she watched him speak, she could see how much he had changed. His efforts were no longer about proving something to the world. They were about proving something to himself. She couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and uncertainty. Her own journey was still unfolding, but Brian's newfound success was undeniable, and a part of her began to share in it, if only just a little. Charles, as always, remained on the sidelines, observing from a distance. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He didn't need the recognition. But as he watched his son speak, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride stirring inside him. Brian was no longer the spoiled, entitled man who had walked away from him all those years ago. The man on that stage, speaking of his failures with such humility, was someone Charles could respect. He had come a long way, and Charles knew that this moment, the one he had been waiting for, was his son's. It wasn't about the business anymore. It was about the man Brian had become. "This is what you were meant for," Charles whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. His words weren't meant for anyone else. They were just for him, for the peace he had long searched for. His son had finally found his path. Brian's public image had shifted dramatically, but it wasn't just about the headlines anymore. He was aware now, more than ever, that success wasn't something handed to him. It was something he had to continue earning every day. The past was still there, a reminder of who he had been, but it no longer defined him. And as the family's image shifted from one tarnished by greed to one of quiet strength and perseverance, Charles knew the journey wasn't over. They were still rebuilding, still growing. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of peace, though it was fragile. It was clear that while the family had come a long way, the road ahead was still full of challenges. Would they be able to maintain this fragile peace, or would the weight of the past continue to pull at them? Samantha stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The glow of the lights blurred through the glass, mirroring the uncertainty swirling inside her. She had always been driven, always believed in her ability to climb higher, to succeed. But now, with a job offer in hand, one that would take her to a new city, a new life, she was unsure of how to feel. The offer was the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed of for years, one that would advance her career in ways she hadn't imagined. It was everything she had worked for, but the cost was steep. It would put distance not only between her and the career she had built, but also between her and Brian, and more critically, between her and the family they had started to rebuild. Brian sat at the kitchen table, papers scattered around him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been quiet for days, ever since Samantha had first mentioned the offer. It wasn't that he didn't want her to succeed. He did. In fact, he admired her drive, her ambition. But something about this, something about her leaving, unsettled him. He wasn't sure how it would change their relationship, how it would change everything they'd worked toward together. Was this a step forward or a step apart? He watched her from across the room now, her back turned to him, the tension in the space thick. "Samantha, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. "I mean, moving across the country, it's a huge change." She turned to face him, her expression a mix of determination and hesitation. "It's the right move for my career, Brian. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I need to do this. For me." Her words were firm, but Brian could hear the undertones of uncertainty in her voice. She wasn't just leaving a job, she was leaving behind a life they had started to rebuild together. Brian's heart clenched, but he knew she was right. He knew this was the opportunity she needed, but still, a part of him felt betrayed by the timing, by the choice. He couldn't help but feel like the distance would be too much. I don't want to lose you, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. We've come so far, and now you're going. He couldn't quite mask the hurt in his words, the vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. Charles, who had been quietly observing the shift between them, finally spoke. He had seen this coming long before either of them had. The family's dynamics were changing again, and while it was painful, it was necessary. Brian, he said, his voice steady and sure, you have to let her go, just as I had to let you go. The words struck Brian harder than he expected. He had never seen it from that angle, the way Charles had let him find his own path. Let her go, Charles repeated, the wisdom in his voice resonating. You can't hold her back, not when this is what she needs. She's doing this for herself, just like you had to do for yourself. The realization hit Brian hard. He had always seen his relationship with Samantha as one of partnership, but he had failed to see how much of it had been driven by his own need for stability. He wanted her to be there, with him, but the truth was that she needed to be somewhere else, for herself. Samantha, too, felt the weight of the decision. The job offer was a dream, one that would define her career, but it also meant walking away from the life she had started to build with Brian. After a long silence, she made her decision. I'm taking the job, she said quietly, her voice tinged with the quiet strength she had finally found. This is what I need, Brian. It's time for me to move forward. Brian looked at her, his heart heavy, but there was no denying it. This was her moment, her chance to grow, to be the woman she had always wanted to be. He wasn't sure how things would look from here, but he knew this was a step forward for both of them. As Samantha packed her things in the days that followed, the house felt emptier than it had in a long time. Charles watched the shift in the family dynamic from his place on the sidelines. He knew this was part of the journey, part of their growth, but he also knew that the road ahead would be a long one. The peace they had found was fragile, and the uncertainty of the future still loomed large. Would their family ever truly heal, or would the changes tear them apart once more? Time would tell. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, and Charles hesitated for a moment before standing up from his chair. It was late in the afternoon, the light dimming softly outside, and he had been alone, as he often was these days. He walked to the door, his mind already rehearsing 1,000 potential scenarios. Who could it be? As the door swung open, his breath caught in his chest. Standing on the other side was Samantha. She was dressed simply, but with a sense of purpose in her posture, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in her eyes, something Charles couldn't quite place, that made his heart race. He didn't know if he was more surprised or confused, but he simply stepped aside and allowed her in. You came back, he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, as though acknowledging the weight of what her presence meant. Samantha nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything that had passed was finally taking its toll. She had moved away months ago, started over in a new city, and Charles had kept his distance, as he always did. I didn't know where else to go, she said, her voice low but steady. I needed to see you. I needed to... She stopped herself, searching for the words. Charles gestured for her to sit, his demeanor unchanged, calm as always. Sit down, Samantha, he said, his voice gentle but firm. What's on your mind? For a moment, she didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Charles, ever patient, simply waited. Finally, Samantha exhaled deeply, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret, something far deeper than what she had shown him in the past. I owe you an apology, she began, her voice breaking slightly. I know I was wrong how I treated you. I judged you, manipulated things to get what I wanted. I've been so blinded by what I thought I deserved that I never saw the damage I was causing. And I see it now. Her voice was soft, sincere, but there was a weight to her words that felt almost like a confession. Charles didn't interrupt, didn't try to ease the tension in her words. He simply listened, his expression unreadable but attentive. "I see it now," she repeated, looking him in the eye, her voice firm yet vulnerable. "You were right all along. You weren't just being hard on me. You were trying to teach me something I didn't understand. I didn't appreciate it, but I do now." Charles remained silent, nodding slowly. His eyes softened, but he didn't rush to comfort her. This wasn't about fixing things immediately. It was about giving her the space to come to terms with her own journey. "I've always hoped you'd find your way," he said quietly, his voice steady, a simple acknowledgement of the truth he had always known. For a moment, the air between them seemed to still, as if the years of tension had finally found their release. Samantha, once so defensive, so insistent on being right, was now seeing the depth of the lessons Charles had tried to impart. She sat there for a moment longer, her eyes distant as she reflected on the weight of everything that had passed, everything she had learned, and everything she had lost. Charles didn't push her. Instead, they shared a quiet moment together, a rare silence that wasn't filled with resentment, but with understanding. The family, in this fragile moment, was no longer as fractured as it had once been. Something had shifted between them, respect, finally, as the foundation of their new relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete, but it was a start. As Samantha rose to leave, Charles watched her, the same calm expression on his face. She had come back, but what now? Would this change last, or would the world around them shift again, testing their newfound connection? The questions lingered, unanswered, as she closed the door softly behind her. And as Charles sat in the stillness of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another beginning. Brian and Samantha had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less like a forced compromise and more like a natural evolution. They no longer worked together, no longer shared the same life in the same house. But there was something else, something unspoken, that had grown between them. They had learned to respect each other again, each finding their own path, but supporting one another from a distance. Their conversations were no longer filled with the sharp edges of resentment. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of each other's strengths. Brian had his business, his hard-earned success, and Samantha had her career, built from the ground up in a city far from where she had once called home. The distance between them wasn't just geographical, it was emotional too. But that wasn't a bad thing. It was necessary. They were no longer each other's crutches, no longer bound by the weight of their shared mistakes. They had learned to be separate, yet still, in a strange way, connected. "I'm proud of you," Samantha said one afternoon, a rare moment of warmth in her voice, as she picked up the phone to speak with Brian. It was a small admission, but it was enough. Brian paused, a genuine smile pulling at his lips. "I'm proud of you too," he said. It wasn't just the words, it was the truth behind them. They had both come so far in different ways, but they had arrived at a place where respect was no longer something they fought for. It simply existed. Charles, meanwhile, continued his quiet life in his apartment. He had no need to search for answers anymore. He watched from a distance, content with the progress his family had made. The phone calls between him and Brian had become less strained, less about proving something and more about understanding. Samantha's visits, too, were more frequent, but each time she left, there was a sense that the family was shifting in ways that couldn't be undone. They were evolving, not in the way Charles had imagined, but in a way that was more real, more grounded. As Charles sat alone in the evenings, looking out over the city skyline, he reflected on how far they had come. It wasn't just the business success or the new jobs they had built. It was the emotional growth, the maturity they had each reached in their own way. There was no longer the same anger between them, no longer the blame that had once defined their interactions. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had learned how to carry their own weight, how to stand on their own, and most importantly, how to do it without losing each other in the process. Sometimes, family doesn't mean living in the same house, Charles thought to himself, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He had spent so much of his life thinking that the only way to be a family was to be physically close, but now he understood that family could mean so much more. It was about the respect, the understanding, the willingness to let each other go, knowing they were still there when it mattered. The family dynamics had shifted. They no longer relied on each other for validation or support, but they cooperated in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't about dependence, it was about mutual respect. And as Charles sat there, the soft hum of the city outside, he finally felt a sense of peace. He had done all he could to guide them. The rest was up to them. But as the city lights flickered on, Charles knew the journey wasn't over. They had come far, but there was still more ahead. What would the future hold for this new, more independent family? Would the peace last, or would life once again challenge everything they had built? Brian sat at his desk, the weight of the decision pressing on him. His company, once struggling, was now thriving. The growth had been slow at first, but the steady, consistent work had finally begun to pay off. He had built something of his own, something to be proud of. And now, with a new business venture on the table, one that could take him to the next level, he was faced with a choice. Take the risk and grow even faster, or play it safe and consolidate what he had already achieved. The opportunity was substantial. The investors were promising, the terms were favorable, but there were no guarantees. The venture could either propel his company to heights he had once only dreamed of, or it could be the thing that brought it all crashing down. He ran his hands through his hair, staring at the proposal in front of him. It was tempting. Too tempting to ignore, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling of hesitation, the fear of losing it all, the fear of failing again. Was he ready to take such a big leap? He needed advice. There was only one person he could turn to now, someone who had seen it all, someone who had always told him to trust his instincts, but also to think carefully about the risks he took. Charles, his father. Brian picked up the phone and dialed Charles's number. The call went through after a few rings, and when Charles answered, his voice was calm as always. "Dad," Brian said, trying to keep his tone steady, though the uncertainty slipped through. "I've been offered a new business opportunity, something that could really push the company forward. But I'm torn. It's a big risk, and I'm not sure if it's worth it." There was a pause on the other end, and then Charles spoke. "Only you can decide if it's worth it, Brian," he said simply. "No one else can make that decision for you. But you've worked hard to get here. You've learned the lessons, and you've got the strength to handle whatever comes your way. Trust yourself." Brian let the words sink in. His father had always been direct, never sugarcoating anything. But this was different. It wasn't advice about business strategy or finances. It was about trusting his own judgment. And for the first time in a long while, Brian realized that his father wasn't just guiding him toward success in business. He was teaching him how to trust his own growth, his own capacity to navigate uncertainty. Brian hung up the phone, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the proposal again. The decision felt like a leap, but it also felt like the next step in his journey. He could play it safe, stay comfortable in what he knew, or he could take the plunge and see how far he could go. After weighing the pros and cons, after considering all the risks, Brian made his decision. He was going to take the leap. He was going to pursue the opportunity, no matter how uncertain it felt. Months later, the risk paid off. The company expanded, securing new partnerships, and the financial growth surpassed what Brian had hoped for. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that he had taken the risk and come out stronger on the other side. The venture had cemented his place in the business world, and for the first time, Brian knew that his success had come not just from ambition, but from hard work and the wisdom his father had imparted. When he called Charles to share the news, he could hear the pride in his father's voice. "You did it," Charles said. "I'm proud of you, Brian." And as Brian sat back, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, he realized something deeper. His success was no longer defined by the victories or the losses. It was defined by the strength he had learned to find within himself, the strength that his father had always known was there. Samantha sat in her new office, the skyline stretching out before her, the city alive with possibility. She had come a long way since leaving behind the life she once knew, the luxury, the entitlement, the endless pursuit of things she now realized didn't matter. Her new role had blossomed into something more than she had imagined, and each day brought a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. There were challenges, of course, but they were challenges she welcomed now. She had built something real, something rooted in her own effort, and for the first time in a long time, she could feel herself truly standing on her own. As the days passed, however, she found herself reflecting on the past more than she had expected. The decisions, the manipulations, the times when she had let her own insecurities drive her behavior, those memories weighed on her. But along with the regret came a surprising sense of gratitude. Every mistake, every wrong turn had led her to this moment. She had learned things about herself, about life, that she had never understood before. I wouldn't be here without those lessons, she thought, the realization sinking in deeper with each passing day. This is who I was meant to be. For the first time, Samantha realized she wasn't relying on Brian or material wealth to define her. She wasn't leaning on anyone else's success or validation. She was building her own future from the ground up, and the satisfaction that came from that felt like something entirely new. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away from her old life, full of uncertainty and bitterness. She was someone different now, someone stronger, more self-aware, and at peace with the choices she had made. Charles, from his quiet place on the sidelines, had watched the transformation. He had seen her from the beginning, from the woman who had manipulated situations to get what she wanted, to the woman she was becoming now. It was slow, this change, but it was real. He didn't intervene, didn't rush to offer advice or guidance. He knew that she needed to find her own way, as he had done, as Brian had done. But there was a quiet pride in his heart as he observed her growth from afar. She had found her footing, and in doing so, had started to rebuild not just her life, but the bridges she had once burned. The family, once so divided by resentment and confusion, had started to heal. Each of them, Brian, Samantha, and Charles, had found their own path, and in doing so, had found a quiet, mutual respect for one another. They no longer needed to be bound by the same house, the same expectations. They were individuals now, but somehow that made them stronger. They didn't rely on each other in the same way, but they knew the strength of their connection was built on respect, not obligation, not manipulation. One afternoon, Samantha arrived at Charles's apartment, a small bouquet of flowers in her hand. She had been meaning to visit for weeks, but life had moved so quickly. Now, standing before him, she finally felt ready to say what she had been carrying with her for so long. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but filled with sincerity. "You helped me find myself." The words felt strange, unfamiliar, but they were the truth. She had spent so many years resisting his guidance, but now she saw the wisdom in everything he had tried to teach her. Charles stood quietly for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, and then, without hesitation, he nodded. "I always knew you'd get there," he said simply. It wasn't an apology, nor was it a grand declaration. It was just the truth, the same way his quiet wisdom had always been. As Samantha left, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders, she knew that this was only the beginning. She had found her way, but there was still much to learn. Her journey was far from over, and as she stepped into the future, she understood now more than ever that growth was an ongoing process. But for now, she felt peace. Peace in herself, in her life, and in the new, fragile, but hopeful bond she had with her family. Charles stood by the window of his modest apartment, gazing out at the city he had known for most of his life. The skyline, once a symbol of ambition and success, now seemed distant, as though it belonged to someone else. His life had been driven by the pursuit of wealth, power, and validation for so long. But now, all he craved was something simpler. The hustle had drained him, and the successes felt less significant with each passing year. It was time for a change. He had always believed in the value of hard work and achievement, but lately he felt that something was missing. It wasn't the financial success or the status that had once defined him. What he needed now was fulfillment, a sense of purpose that extended beyond himself. So Charles made a decision. He would return to his roots. He would spend more time volunteering, working on personal projects that brought him joy, rather than chasing after the next big deal. As he began to immerse himself in community work, Charles found a quiet peace in helping others, something he hadn't realized he was missing. He began volunteering at local shelters, helping to organize neighborhood cleanups, and mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded him of his younger self. It wasn't grand and it wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, Charles felt like he was truly contributing to something greater than himself. In those quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, Charles reflected on the life he had lived. So much had changed over the years: his family, his priorities, his values, the struggles he had faced, the losses he had endured, the lessons he had learned. He realized how far he had come, not just in terms of material wealth, but in his understanding of life and the people around him. There had been so many moments of anger and frustration, so many missed opportunities to truly connect with his family. But now, looking back, he saw the journey as a whole, and it was clear the real measure of his life was not what he had accumulated, but what he had given. Brian and Samantha were succeeding in their own ways now, carving out their futures with the same determination that Charles had once had. But even in their success, they both knew the most important lesson Charles had taught them was the value of family. The struggles of the past were behind them now, but the lessons learned in those dark moments would stay with them forever. They had learned the importance of respect, of standing on their own, and of the need for a deep connection that wasn't based on money or status. Charles's return to his roots was recognized in the community. People admired the man who had once built an empire and now spent his time helping others without asking for anything in return. But Charles, ever humble, didn't bask in the recognition. "It's not about the accolades," he told Lucy one afternoon, as they sat on his small balcony watching the sun dip behind the buildings. "It's about making a difference." He meant it. The work he was doing now, the people he was helping, gave him a sense of peace that no business deal ever had. His legacy was no longer about the wealth he had amassed, but about the love and respect he had earned along the way. Charles knew the road had been long and difficult, and there were still moments of doubt. But as he looked back, he felt certain of one thing. He had found peace. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, had finally been laid to rest. What remained now was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in the end, he had done something that truly mattered. But with each passing day, Charles also knew that peace was fleeting, and life would continue to challenge him in ways he hadn't yet anticipated. How long could this newfound balance last? Would the old ambitions ever stir again? The healing process within the family had been slow, but it was unmistakable. Brian and Samantha, once so fractured, now found themselves on separate paths, but with a shared understanding of what they had been through. Their journey of growth had changed them in ways they couldn't have predicted. Brian, with his business continuing to thrive, had learned to live with the weight of his past mistakes. He had learned that success wasn't just about the deals he made or the money he earned. It was about what kind of person he had become in the process. Samantha, on the other hand, had found fulfillment in her new career, in a city far from where she once felt lost. But what connected them now wasn't just their individual success. It was the understanding that they no longer needed to carry the burden of resentment. They had been through so much, and now they understood that healing was not just about moving on. It was about moving forward together, even if that meant from a distance. They began to spend more time together. It wasn't the kind of closeness that came with living under the same roof, but it was different, more meaningful. They started having dinners together, talking about things they never had before, their fears, their triumphs, their dreams. Conversations that had once been laden with blame now carried a sense of camaraderie. Their shared experience, the pain and growth they had gone through, had brought them to a place where understanding each other's struggles was enough to build something new. The bond was no longer about obligation. It was about genuine support. "We've all been through so much," Brian said one evening, his voice a bit softer than it used to be. "But now we know how to help each other." Samantha nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of his words. She had once relied so heavily on Brian's approval, on external validation, but now she was starting to see their relationship as something rooted in emotional support, not dependency. They weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension, but they had found a way to care for each other without the need for constant validation. It was a strange, quiet peace. Charles, too, had found his own sense of peace. He had shifted his focus from the material to the meaningful. His work with the community, helping others, giving back, had become a central part of his life. It wasn't grand gestures or public recognition that brought him satisfaction anymore. It was the quiet work, the slow, steady contribution that made a real difference in people's lives. In those moments, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The world didn't need to applaud him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He was content. When he heard about the changes in Brian and Samantha, his heart warmed, though he didn't show it outwardly. He smiled quietly to himself, a small, unspoken satisfaction settling in his chest. His children, once so lost, had finally found their way. It wasn't the journey he had imagined for them, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The family had come so far, yet there was still more to learn, more to experience. The wounds of the past were healing, but the scars remained, reminders of what they had been through. But as they navigated their new dynamic, they did so with understanding and a deeper respect for one another. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just connected by blood. They were connected by the silent acknowledgement of their shared growth. And as Charles stood by the window, looking out at the city below, he couldn't help but wonder, could the peace they had finally found last? Would life continue to challenge them, or had they reached a new chapter in their story? The questions lingered in the air, unresolved, just as the future always would be. Charles sat in his favorite chair, the one by the window, his mind wandering as he gazed out at the changing world below. It had been years since he had felt the quiet satisfaction of having accomplished something that truly mattered. Now, with the family mended, his life felt like it had come full circle. Yet, there was something still lingering, something he couldn't shake. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. Gregory Chase. Old friends, old memories. Gregory had been there for everything. Business dealings, family struggles, and the long, silent years when Charles had stood alone, watching his family unravel. Gregory was a reminder of the past, but not the past he regretted. Rather, the past he had built, piece by piece. "Gregory," Charles said, his voice warm but tinged with something more, something deeper. Gregory stepped inside, shaking off his coat, the same practiced smile on his face. "Still keeping things quiet, I see," Gregory remarked, looking around the sparse apartment with a knowing glance. Charles chuckled softly. "I've learned to enjoy the silence." Gregory settled into the chair across from him, his presence familiar, yet heavy with unspoken thoughts. "You've accomplished more than most could ever dream of, you know. It's been a long road, but looking at where you are now, you've built a legacy." Charles shifted in his chair, looking out at the horizon. "Maybe, but what matters most to me now It's not the empire, not the wealth. It's the lessons, the things I've taught my family. That's what will last. He leaned back, reflecting on the past. The years spent building his career, the sacrifice, the pain of watching his children struggle, the endless battles with his own pride. But through all the chaos, he had always known one thing. What he passed down to them was the most important thing he could leave behind. The wisdom, the strength, the knowledge of how to stand on their own. Those lessons would ripple through the generations. Gregory sat quietly, the weight of the words between them settling in. Finally, he spoke. "I think you've done more than you realize, Charles. And they, your kids, they're stronger because of you. They'll carry that forward, whether they know it or not." Charles nodded slowly, grateful for his old friend's understanding. But there was still that lingering weight, the feeling that time was slipping away, that things were almost done. Later that day, Brian and Samantha arrived, their presence a quiet testament to the growth they had each undergone. The dynamic between them had changed. There was an unspoken respect now, a maturity that hadn't existed before. They had found common ground, built something new out of the rubble of their past. And as they sat together in the living room, Charles felt the weight of their gratitude in the air. They no longer needed to say much. Their actions spoke louder than words. Charles felt a pang in his chest as they shared stories, laughed at old memories, and reflected on how far they had come. He realized then that, despite everything, despite the years of mistakes, misunderstandings, and distance, the family had finally found its way back to each other. As the evening wore on, they made their way to the house Charles had built. It was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of everything they had been through. The past, with all its struggles and heartache, had given way to something new, something stronger. Charles stood in the doorway, watching his children, his family, gathered together for one last time in that space. It was worth it, Charles thought, as he looked around the room, taking in the quiet warmth of their presence. When the last of the conversations had died down and the final goodbyes were said, Charles closed the door to the house behind him one last time. His legacy, in all its imperfections, was secure. And as he stood there in the stillness, the weight of the past finally lifted from his shoulders. But there was still a part of him that wondered, what now? Was the journey truly over, or had it only just begun? Charles had always believed in the quiet strength of service, and as he continued his work in the community, he found more peace in the act of giving than he ever had in building an empire. The days were long, filled with organizing community events, mentoring the next generation, and lending a hand wherever it was needed. But Charles didn't mind the work. It felt like the right thing to do. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the small, meaningful contributions that, over time, added up to something greater. A legacy, perhaps. Something that would outlast him, even after he was gone. He had started this journey when his family was still broken, when the wounds of the past were too fresh to heal. But now, years later, he could see the impact of his actions, not just in the lives of the people he helped, but in his children as well. Brian and Samantha, once so focused on their own success, had found their way into giving back in a way they never had before. The lessons they had learned, slowly and painfully, had taken root. They had seen firsthand how success could be hollow without something deeper to anchor it. Brian's company was flourishing, but his perspective had shifted. The drive for wealth, the relentless pursuit of status, those things no longer mattered the way they used to. Now, Brian found fulfillment in helping others, in mentoring young entrepreneurs, and providing opportunities for those who had nowhere else to turn. It wasn't about charity. It was about equity, about leveling the playing field for everyone, regardless of where they started. "This is what life is about," Brian said one evening, reflecting on how far he had come. "Success is measured not by wealth, but by the impact we have on others. His words were simple, but they carried weight, a truth he had only recently come to understand. Samantha, too, had found her own calling. Once so focused on her own career, she now led charity initiatives that reflected the values Charles had instilled in her, even when she hadn't fully appreciated them. She worked with organizations that helped women and children, and with every project she took on, she could feel herself becoming more grounded in the purpose of it all. It was no longer just about personal gain. It was about creating change, about leaving the world better than she had found it. Each step she took felt like a small, deliberate choice to honor the lessons her father had taught her. As the years passed, Charles's influence was felt in every corner of his community. People spoke of him with respect, not because of his wealth or his position, but because of the quiet ways he had shaped their lives, how he had led by example, showing them that true strength wasn't about power, but about character. His legacy was no longer something tangible, something that could be measured by assets or achievements. It was in the people he had touched, the lives he had changed, and the values he had passed down to his children. On a quiet evening, Brian sat alone in his office, the weight of everything finally settling in. He thought of his father, of all the lessons he had learned over the years, the anger, the resentment, the pride. It had all faded into something else. "You taught me everything I needed to know," Brian whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, he realized how much of his father's strength had flowed through him, how his actions had rippled outward, shaping the world in ways that would continue long after he was gone. Samantha, too, had found her own way to honor Charles's legacy. Leading initiatives that gave back, she knew she was following in his footsteps. Each project, each moment of service, was a quiet tribute to the man who had shown her what truly mattered. Their family, once fractured, was now forever changed, bound by the understanding that their success was not just measured by what they had, but by what they gave. The ripple effect of Charles's life would continue far beyond his years, but even as they walked forward, there was a sense that something was still shifting. Would the legacy he had built continue to grow, or would the weight of their past threaten to pull them back? Time, as always, would tell. Charles sat in his favorite chair by the window, his once vibrant eyes now dulled by age, but still holding the sharpness of a man who had seen and experienced more than most. The world outside had changed in ways he never could have anticipated, but he had too. Time had softened him, but the lessons he had passed down to his children, Brian and Samantha, were still alive, running through them like threads woven into the fabric of their lives. He had spent years building an empire, chasing success, and while those days felt distant now, they had brought him to this quiet place. His thoughts often wandered back to the past, to the mistakes he had made and the lessons learned through hardship. But as he grew older, he found solace in the knowledge that those lessons had stuck. The things he had hoped his children would learn, the wisdom he had tried so hard to impart, had taken root. They had grown, not just in success, but in character, and that was something he could be proud of. One evening, as the sun set, painting the room with soft golden light, Brian and Samantha sat beside him. They were both older now, their faces marked by the challenges they had faced and overcome. There was no longer the distance that had once separated them, no longer the awkwardness, the unspoken words. They had found their way to each other and to him. Charles could feel it in the air, the quiet bond that had formed, steady and strong. "It's hard to believe how much time has passed," Brian said, breaking the silence, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "So much has happened, so much has changed, and we've all changed with it." Charles nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at them. There was no need for grand speeches or explanations anymore. They had all learned the most important lessons on their own. But there was one final piece of wisdom he needed to share, one last lesson for them to carry forward. "Never stop learning," Charles said, his voice low and steady. "Never stop growing. Life doesn't slow down, and neither should you. There's always more to understand, more to do. Don't ever think you've got it all figured out. Brian and Samantha listened, their eyes fixed on him, the gravity of his words sinking in. They had learned a lot from him over the years, perhaps more than they had ever realized. But now, as they sat there together, something clicked. They weren't the same people they had been when they first left home, full of anger and confusion. They had learned, not just from their mistakes, but from the way Charles had always carried himself, quietly and steadily, without expectation of recognition. "You've given us everything," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just the lessons Charles had taught him, it was the strength he had shown, the way he had navigated life with quiet dignity. "Everything we are, it's because of you." Samantha, sitting close beside him, nodded. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. "Now you can rest, Dad." Charles smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. They had finally understood. They were ready to carry on the lessons he had worked so hard to teach them. They had grown into the people he had always hoped they would become. He closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world outside, the future, it didn't matter anymore. He had done what he needed to do. He had given them the tools to succeed, not just in business, but in life. And with that, he knew, deep down, his legacy was secure. But as he sat there, at peace, there was a flicker of thought that lingered. What would their journey look like without him there to guide them? Would they remember? Would they be okay? Charles, content in the quiet of the room, let the questions fade. For now, they were ready. For now, the past, the lessons, the work, it was all enough. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the sound of the ocean carrying a calming rhythm as Charles walked alone along the beach. The evening sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, the sunset casting long shadows on the sand. It was a quiet moment, the kind he had learned to cherish. In his younger years, he would have seen the beauty of the scene as something to be conquered, another challenge, another goal to reach. Now it was just something to experience, to soak in without the need for anything more. He walked slowly, each step steady and deliberate, feeling the cool breeze on his face. There had been so much in his life, so much he had fought for, so much he had lost, and so much he had learned. The triumphs, the failures, the moments of doubt, all of it had led him here, to this peaceful place, to this moment of quiet reflection. For so long, he had believed that success was about wealth, about status, about being seen. But now, with the sun setting behind him, he knew better. Charles thought back on the journey, on the mistakes, the heartache, and the long years of trying to get it all right. He remembered the times when he had been at his lowest, when the weight of his decisions had threatened to break him. But he also remembered the moments of victory, the quiet victories, when he had made the right choice, even when it was hard. The family, the lessons he had taught them, the strength they had all found in each other. Those were the true triumphs. Brian and Samantha were living proof of that. Their bond, forged through hardship, was now stronger than it had ever been. They had their own paths to follow, their own lives to lead, but they were no longer divided by anger or bitterness. The lessons they had learned from the past had shaped them into people they could be proud of. They didn't need the house or the wealth anymore. They had found something more valuable: understanding, respect, and the ability to support each other no matter the distance between them. Charles paused at the edge of the water, watching as the tide came in and out, its pull steady and unyielding. "I never needed the house," he thought quietly to himself, the weight of the words sinking in. "Just the love of my family." It was a truth he had only fully understood now, after everything that had happened. The house, the possessions, the things he had fought so hard for, they didn't matter in the end. What mattered was the connection, the people who had walked beside him through all the ups and downs. The past, with all its pain and joy, was gone. It had shaped him, yes, but it no longer defined him. The lessons would remain, etched into his soul, carried forward by Brian and Samantha, who had finally understood the value of what really mattered. The family was no longer defined by wealth or conflict, but by the shared experience of growth and redemption. Charles let the peace of the moment wash over him. The noise of the world faded away, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at ease. A smile, small but genuine, crossed his face. He had earned this peace, and though the future was always uncertain, for now, he was content. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles felt something else stir within him, a quiet hope. Would his family continue to thrive, to honor the lessons they had learned, or would the shadows of the past creep back in? He didn't know, but for now, in this moment, the peace he had earned was enough. And yet, as the tide rolled in, he couldn't shake the thought that the true test of everything they had been through was still to come. Would the peace last, or would it slip away like the fading sunlight? Charles sat quietly on the old bench by the window, his eyes tracing the horizon as the sun dipped below the skyline. The years had been long, and at times they had felt endless. But now, in this stillness, there was a peace that had eluded him for much of his life. The battles, the mistakes, the moments of triumph, they all seemed distant now, fading into the background as the present took center stage. His life, once defined by the pursuit of success and the weight of his own expectations, had come full circle. He thought back to the struggles of the past, the ambition that had driven him, the relationships that had fractured under the strain of his choices. There had been a time when everything felt like it was falling apart, when his family was scattered, broken by the weight of his decisions and the walls he had built around himself. The house, the wealth, the status, it had all been hollow without the connection he so desperately craved. But now, that connection was no longer in question. His family, the ones he had once alienated, had healed. Brian and Samantha had found their way, each walking their own path, but carrying the lessons he had imparted along the way. They had learned to see beyond the material things, beyond the bitterness, and had come to understand the true value of family. They weren't perfect, and neither was he. But together, they had rebuilt what had once seemed irreparably broken. They left me at the airport, Charles thought, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He remembered the day, long ago, when Brian and Samantha had walked away, uncertain of how to move forward with him. He had stood there, watching them leave, feeling the weight of their departure like a physical blow. But now, looking back, he understood something he hadn't before. They had left, yes, but in the end, he had found his way home. Not to the house, not to the life he had once known, but to something deeper, to peace, to understanding, to the love of his family that had grown stronger with time. The sun was setting, casting the room in a warm golden glow. It was a quiet, perfect moment, one that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. There was no fanfare, no dramatic conclusion, just the simple understanding that the journey had reached its end. The house, the wealth, the struggles, they were all behind him now. The things he had fought for, the things he had lost, no longer defined him. What mattered now was what he had built, not with his hands, but with his heart. The family he had raised, the lessons they had learned, and the legacy they would carry forward. Charles took a deep breath, letting the peace settle in his chest. The family's legacy was secure. It wasn't built on the things that had once seemed so important, but on love, on growth, and on hard-earned wisdom. As he looked out at the fading light, he knew that his journey had been long, but it had been worth it. The story ends with a quiet smile, Charles reflecting on how justice doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to demand attention or make a grand display. It simply arrives in the moments when we least expect it, in the spaces we've created through love and understanding. And as the final light of the day flickered out, Charles knew that his legacy would continue, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty that his family had finally found its way. The question remained, though, what now? What new chapter awaited them? The future, like the fading light, was a mystery, one that only time would reveal.